I'm Dave Karp. I'm a professor at George Washington University in the School of Media and Public Affairs, scholar of internet politics, and we are, some of my students are, this is a funeral and you're like cheering in the back, come on. We're here today to celebrate and remember CrowdTangle. And so I wanted to start with just a brief story about how I got to know CrowdTangle, which was in its youth. I met Brandon, the creator of CrowdTangle, and I believe it was 2013 at a conference when I was working on a book about how nonprofits use analytics and data to inform their activism. This was before CrowdTangle had become part of Facebook. And it was this wonderful tool that nonprofit political organizations could use, where they would identify their network neighbors, similar organizations to them, and CrowdTangle would then assess what's going through their Facebook pages, identify the baselines for how much traffic they usually get, and when they get more traffic, then it would send an email saying, here is what people are talking about in your network neighborhood. And this struck me as this brilliant, independent tool for us as the public to see what was going on online. I wrote about it in this book that came out in 2016, Analytic Activism, about these sorts of tools that allowed for big listening, for digital listening, so that organizations could become more attuned to their publics and use that to build power. I was thinking about that book recently, not just because of CrowdTangle, but because of another message that was in that book. In a different chapter that CrowdTangle wasn't in, I told the story of an organization called Upworthy, which for a brief period dominated the internet, mostly through mastering Facebook traffic. And then Facebook essentially decided, you know what, we would like that traffic, please. Adjusted their algorithm, introduced their new product, their own product, and that spelled the end, at least of Upworthy's traffic. And the message that I had in the book there was that if you live by the Facebook algorithm, you die by the Facebook algorithm. CrowdTangle went on to be one of the finest tools for researchers to understand what's going on at Facebook. For a long time, it was our window. And here we are today, reflecting on that window, what it showed us for a while, how it's gone now, and what comes next. We're going to begin with some remarks from Julia Angwin, who is the perfect person to introduce this. I was thinking about this recently. Julia Angwin has been, I think, basically the leading tech journalist, critical tech journalist, for well over a decade now. She was at the Wall Street Journal for years. She was at ProPublica for years. She was a co-founder of The Markup. She has a new organization now, Proof. I was thinking recently that when you hear that Julia Angwin has a piece coming out about a tech organization, the feeling is akin to finding out that the reporter from the New Yorker wants to call you. Now I'm blanking on his name because it's in the moment. No, not Kevin. What's that? Isaac Shatner, right? When Shatner wants to talk to you, you know trouble is coming. And when Julia Angwin has a piece coming out, you know trouble is coming, and we all tune in. So Julia Angwin, as our leading data journalist who holds these companies responsible, is here to memorialize CrowdTangle and talk to us about what we had, what we lost, and what comes next. Julia.
Hello, fellow mourners. We are gathered here today to celebrate the life and times of a piece of software called CrowdTangle. To state the obvious, it's not normal to hold funerals for software, but this software stood for something bigger than its executables. It stood for the power of the people against corporations that control and shape our speech. We grieve its loss, and we seek to use its life as inspiration to build a brighter future. CrowdTangle did something essential. It allowed us to see what was on the public's newsstand. For those of you too young to remember what a newsstand is, it was a place where you could buy a wide range of newspapers and magazines. The one near my apartment in New York was a standalone metal shed on a street corner operated by an Indian immigrant. The shed is still there, but now they just sell sodas and candy. Back then, though, visiting a newsstand was a way of dipping into the zeitgeist. In one glance, you could take in all the magazine covers and top newspaper headlines. You could also tell which publications had paid for better placement. They were the ones in front with more of their pages visible. The lesser publications were in the back, or sometimes you even had to ask if they had one. During big public events, whether it was a presidential election or the O.J. Simpson trial, scanning the headlines at the newsstand was a way to get a sense of the pulse of America. I remember when I lived in DC as a young reporter right out of college during the Clinton administration, when the Republicans took the House for the first time in 40 years. All the newsstand headlines were about the House Speaker, Newt Gingrich, and his contract with America. But algorithmic news feeds changed all that. In 2006, Facebook introduced the first news feed, and soon after that, all the other social platforms followed. The zeitgeist moved online and became personalized. My newsstand became the items in my feed, and it looked entirely different from your newsstand, which was items in your feed. And that was entirely different from my mom's feed and your brother's feed and your uncle's feed. And in the beginning, we felt like we had some control over these feeds by choosing who to friend or who to follow. But slowly, the tech companies started taking over our feeds. They interrupted us with recommendations for groups to join and pages to follow, posts to like, advertisements to click on, and people to poke. Does anyone remember poking? This was an early Facebook feature that allowed you to poke someone's profile. I honestly cannot even tell you what it actually meant. But anyway, the craziest thing about this new algorithmic life we were all leading was that none of us had any idea what anyone else was seeing. Everyone was in their own filter bubble shaped by technology, and the zeitgeist had splintered into million feeds, and no one could see it all in a glance. Enter CrowdTangle. It arrived on the scene and gave us a glimpse into zeitgeist. CrowdTangle was created in 2012 by Brandon Silverman and Matt Gammer. They were originally trying to solve a different problem: how to help advocates organize better on Facebook, but soon realized the most useful part of their tool was the dashboard that let organizations see how their Facebook posts were performing. Soon, CrowdTangle became the best and only way to get a sense of what was happening on the biggest and most important social platform, Facebook. If you wanted to know what the top performing post on Facebook was, you checked CrowdTangle's dashboard. After the 2016 presidential election, it became clear just how important that transparency was. CrowdTangle wasn't just a tool for dipping into the cultural zeitgeist. The election showed us that Facebook had become the center of political movements around the world. It was where Trump's campaign excelled. It was where the Russians tried to influence our elections. It was where the Burmese government incited violence against the Rohingyas. It was the public square in every nation. And so, perhaps, it was inevitable that such a powerful tool would not survive on its own. Just a few days after the 2016 election, Facebook bought CrowdTangle. At first, Facebook let it continue operating fairly independently, even when it was embarrassing. Journalists and researchers used CrowdTangle to reveal just how far propaganda and lies were spreading across Facebook. Facebook executives defended their platform by saying that CrowdTangle only provided a look at which posts were most engaging, but another metric, reach, would show that less outrageous posts were not what most people were seeing. Side note, I tested that claim. It wasn't true. I built a tool to analyze reach, and it still showed that Facebook was amplifying misleading and extreme content. But ultimately, it seems that transparency was just too embarrassing for Facebook. As journalist Casey Newton wrote, CrowdTangle became perhaps the weirdest product in Facebook's history, beloved by its users and disavowed by its owners. And its demise was inevitable. In 2021, Facebook dissolved the internal CrowdTangle team. In 2022, it stopped accepting new users. And finally, in August of this year, Facebook pulled the plug on CrowdTangle. It had lived just 12 short years. To comply with European transparency laws, Facebook came out with a replacement tool called the Meta Content Library that it claims is better than CrowdTangle. That claim also turns out not to be true. Earlier this year, my newsroom Proof News worked with the Tau Center and the Algorithmic Transparency Institute to compare Meta's new tool with CrowdTangle, and on 11 key metrics, Meta's tool has fewer features than CrowdTangle. And most importantly, unlike CrowdTangle, it's not easily accessible, not by researchers, and not at all accessible to pesky journalists. But Meta says it's awesome. President of Global Affairs, Nick Clegg, says CrowdTangle was a flawed product that only measured a narrow slice of a cake slice. Yes, that's a direct quote, and I do not know how he slices cake. But Clegg also says that Meta's new tool is much, much more robust and much more sophisticated. In other words, Meta says we should not grieve the loss of the public's only meaningful visibility into the public discourse on the most important newsstand in the world. So as I was writing this, I thought, well, how do we mourn a loss when we're being told we haven't lost anything? Well, luckily somebody has tackled this question before, a man named Shakespeare. In his play, Julius Caesar, he has Mark Antony delivering the speech at the funeral of Julius Caesar, who has just been murdered by Roman senators. It's a tricky speech because the senators are convinced that they are better off without Caesar, but Mark Antony wants to subtly remind them of Caesar's virtues. And so, with apologies to the bard, here is my CrowdTangle remix of the Mark Antony speech. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury CrowdTangle, not to praise it. The evil that men does lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So let it be with CrowdTangle. The noble Zuck hath told you CrowdTangle was not robust enough. If it were so, it was a grievous fault. And grievously hath CrowdTangle answered for it. Here, under leave of Meta and the rest, for Zuck is an honorable man, so they are all honorable men. Came I to speak at CrowdTangle's funeral. It was a faithful window into a closed platform, but Zuck says it was not robust enough, and Zuck is an honorable man. He hath brought many legless avatars to the internet and second homes for many executives. And yet, CrowdTangle was not robust. When the propagandists have spread their lies, CrowdTangle hath revealed them. Robustness should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Zuck says it was not robust enough, and Zuck is an honorable man. I speak not to disprove what Zuck spoke, but here I am to speak what I do know. We all did love CrowdTangle once, not without cause. What cause withholds us then to mourn for it? My heart is in the coffin there with CrowdTangle, and I must pause till it come back to me. Thank you very much.
Told you she was good, right? We're gonna invite a few remembrances of CrowdTangle from the audience and from online. First, I do want to pause to have a word of thanks for the sponsor of this event. This event is co-sponsored by the Knight-Georgetown Institute, who is also hosting us here at Georgetown, the Mozilla Foundation, and also the Coalition for Independent Tech Research. Thank you for helping us to put this together. First off, Hallie, do you want to come up and say a few words? Let's come up to the mic.
All right, it's so emotional. I'm going to read from my notes. What can I say? It's just so much going on around her death. I'll always remember her willingness to be there for you. She was like a grandma, always had the best insights, fought for our rights to access, for information, freedom. She always knew what was going on and was up on the best gossip, always open to finding new things, validating a hunch or showing you the way. She was even willing to tell you the things that you didn't want to hear, the scariest, the most hurtful. Some considered her blunt nature flawed, but that's just what comes with ambition. Her friends in trust and safety at Twitter before she too became exed, send their condolences and thank her for her connections and contributions. She succeeded in death by her cousin Birdwatch. And this network now has a broken link. And we will never be able to replace it. So with that, let's share our memories and learn things the way they used to, through word of mouth and through revisionist history. To data, to accessibility, to ranking and authority, and to academic resilience. To CrowdTangle.
Wonderful, and thank you. Now we're going to tempt the tech gods and invite Jewel to speak remotely.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Jule Krüger. I'm a research advisor for quantitative evidence and analysis at Amnesty International. Thank you so much for inviting me today to share with you what a crucial tool CrowdTangle was for Amnesty International's human rights work. I will share with you a summary of how we use the platform and why its discontinuation is a significant loss for the human rights movement. Amnesty International made two main uses of CrowdTangle. First, we used it for our campaigning and communications, engaging in a variety of activities. One of those was social listening, understanding the public concerns about human rights to inform strategy and advocacy. We also used it for monitoring to help us keep track of the human rights movement on social media to support advocacy efforts. We also used it for impact measurement, which helped us assess Amnesty's influence on human rights discourse around the world. And also, it was a tool for content distribution analysis because it helped us evaluate how effectively Amnesty's communications were used across different national sections. Secondly, another big role that CrowdTangle played for us was for our human rights investigations and research. It was a tool that helped us collect data on narrative trends in human rights discourse, and it also allowed us to collect evidence because we were using social media posts as evidence for our human rights investigations. Next, it was a safety assessment tool because it helped us monitor the well-being of human rights defenders and activists on social media. Last but not least, CrowdTangle allowed us to engage in platform monitoring, which means we were able to observe the impact of social media algorithms, content moderation, and other platform operations on human rights issues. At Amnesty, we believe that platforms like CrowdTangle are so important because they help advance several human rights objectives. One of them is transparency and accountability. Platforms like CrowdTangle facilitate the monitoring of social media companies' operations to hold them accountable. It also provides access to public concerns, as it helps us to find and engage with audiovisual evidence of human rights harms posted to social media. And also importantly, CrowdTangle was a platform that provided ease of use for civil society organizations like ourselves. Alternative tools require more technical expertise and resources, raising the barrier of entry and limiting access to valuable information. This leads me to close with a call that we need regulation of big tech companies. Following the trend of Twitter/X in limiting its API access, Meta's decision to close CrowdTangle highlights the need for more regulation because these measures are restricting researcher access. As seen in the European Union's Digital Services Act, mandated research access is crucial for transparency and accountability. The loss of CrowdTangle has significantly impacted Amnesty's ability to perform these crucial functions. This underscores the need for better regulation and access to social media data for human rights work. Thank you.
Thank you. Ellen, you want to come up next?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen Jacobs. I lead U.S. digital policy for the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and I'd like to talk about how CrowdTangle made me all of my work friends. While that's maybe a bit of an exaggeration, amidst the other really touching remembrances about CrowdTangle's capacity for data insights and further access into the platforms, I wanted to talk about an underrated aspect of the tool that CrowdTangle provided, which was showing you the coolest and realest people around you. I came to work with CrowdTangle at the end of its life. As a research organization, my colleagues and I were deeply dismayed to hear about its impending demise, especially since its closure is just the latest in a long line of closures for research tools. So I wanted to write about what that loss would look like from a US perspective. I reached out to Brandy and Claire following their excellent letter and got to know them. I worked with Megan Shahi from the Center for American Progress, and we wrote a letter outlining some of the harms that we anticipated from its closure. I got to know people from 50 other organizations when they signed on to the letter. And of course, a big shout out to our friends on the Hill who also recognized the importance of transparency into the platforms. Even in its closure, CrowdTangle was creating new forms of transparency by connecting the individuals and organizations dedicated to furthering the insights that we have into the social media platforms. Creating these connections means we can pool our collective expertise and advocacy efforts. And though the closure of CrowdTangle, I think, was intended to block our ability to do this work and to silence the ringing alarm bells of our findings, I actually think the closure has amplified our calls, and I would consider this CrowdTangle's parting gift to us. CrowdTangle founder Brandon Silverman noted in a recent article, and as Julia mentioned as well, that CrowdTangle was initially a community organizing tool. And as I look around this room at the motivated and diverse community we have gathered here today, I'd say even in its passing, CrowdTangle achieved that goal.
It's the old line, don't mourn, organize. Next up, Jenny Stromer-Galley.
Success? All right. Hi, everybody. So, like many of you here, I knew CrowdTangle as a facilitator of sunlight to peer into the shadows in the corners. Hold on a second. My video is paused, but maybe you guys can't see me. Does it matter? I'm just gonna, oh no. Oh, sorry, I'm having a tech issue. Of course.
Three at least.
So Dave, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, then I'm not going to worry about whatever is going on with video. And forgive me, I'm just going to start over. So I knew CrowdTangle, as many of you did, as a facilitator of sunlight to peer into the shadows in the corners of the largest social media platform in the United States. I'm a professor at Syracuse University in the School of Information Studies, and I used CrowdTangle to track political candidates and their efforts to persuade and sometimes deceive the public. I collected posts from Trump, from Clinton, Biden, and for a hot minute, Harris, as well as the candidates that ran for Senate and for governor over 4 election cycles. This work is helping us to understand how politicians communicate to their supporters and the public, how it's changed over time, especially with anti-normative candidates like Trump and his influence on down ballot campaigns. And I use CrowdTangle to track the public's engagement with political posts, revealing how effective negative and uncivil messages are on the platform. And yes, CrowdTangle under Meta had its shortcomings, like not being able to get the comments to posts, but I was willing to overlook that flaw. When Meta bought CrowdTangle, the corporation then dictated the terms, and well, you have little choice but to go along. And Meta, like all the big tech companies, continue to dictate the terms, privileging their reputations to please their shareholders, kowtowing to angry politicians and influential figures, and killing off a friend to the public interest and common good. Rest in peace, CrowdTangle. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last mourner, Rochelle Faust.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to share some fond memories of CrowdTangle today. I'm Rochelle Faust, a program officer on the Democracy and Technology team at the National Democratic Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that works with partners around the world to strengthen and safeguard democratic institutions and values. So I only started working with CrowdTangle personally in the year or two before its passing, but I've heard from countless colleagues and NDI partners that CrowdTangle was a truly loyal companion in their efforts to improve their understanding of the information space, particularly during elections and other critical democratic moments. Among other things, CrowdTangle will be remembered for its accessibility and its inclusivity. It was a tool that could be used not only by academics in the United States and Western Europe, but by researchers, journalists, and fact checkers in countries around the world. CrowdTangle was the resident know-it-all, bringing invaluable insights into conversations about mis and disinformation, hate speech, and other online harms. It helps NDI identify political narratives in pro-Beijing and pro-democracy social media spaces following the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong, as well as monitor disinformation targeting candidates ahead of parliamentary elections in Moldova in 2020, along with many, many other projects. CrowdTangle equipped us with the tools to identify and challenge falsehoods, to understand the sources and networks behind them, and to develop strategies for effective interventions. It was always willing to help a friend in need through integration into external software, including social media monitoring tools tailored to the needs of election observers. Beyond its technical capabilities, CrowdTangle fostered a community of dedicated researchers and practitioners united in their mission to facilitate access to timely, accurate information. At NDI, we even had an internal working group of staff using CrowdTangle in vastly different contexts around the world who could come together to share findings and brainstorm strategies to improve their use of the tool. Though it was not without its flaws, CrowdTangle is a model that should be aspired to by all those who come after it. Thank you to CrowdTangle for your service, your insights, and the many ways you enriched our understanding of the digital world. You'll be greatly missed, but never forgotten.
Thank you. I'm now going to invite up my colleague Brandy from CITR to introduce a panel that's going to discuss and mourn, reflect on CrowdTangle, and think about what comes next. Brandy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Brandy Gerking, and I would like to now introduce and invite up some wonderful colleagues and advocates for data access and transparency for researchers who will join us as we discuss the way forward. So this is the part of the program where we talk about rebirth. We talk about what comes next. We talk about how to ensure transparency, even though we've lost something great in losing CrowdTangle. So without further ado, I would like to invite up Rebecca Tromble, who is assistant professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University and is the director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, and is also a co-founder and board member of the Coalition for Independent Tech Research. Thanks for being here, Rebecca. And also would like to invite up Alyssa Cooper, who is the executive director of the Knight-Georgetown Institute. And joining us online is Nadine Fareed Johnson, who is the inaugural policy director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. So to kick off this conversation, hi Nadine, nice to see you. To kick off this conversation, we've talked a lot already and heard from many speakers about the great impact that CrowdTangle had and the loss and what it means for all of us. And just last week, I was actually chatting to a leading reporter, I won't say who they are, who said just for the first time, she was working on a story and reached to go see, okay, well, now I need to open up CrowdTangle, and just thought, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to move forward. I don't know how I'm going to report on this critical issue. And it reminded me of a text message that I got from another reporter right after Meta sent the email saying that they were going to shut down CrowdTangle on the 14th of August that said, I just don't know how we'll survive the election cycle without this data. And to think in numbers about the impact that Meta's decision has had, it's been reported that tens of thousands of people at various points had access to CrowdTangle. And just last week, Meta filed in their first code of practice reports, which to the European Union, that 150 research groups as of June 30 had access to Meta Content Library, which is their new tool that has replaced CrowdTangle, and that there were more than 300 groups that were in the pipeline. And that's a far length off of tens of thousands. So I just want to highlight that as we're thinking about the impact and zooming out a bit to kind of the bigger picture, which is what I want this panel to focus on. You know, this is more about this is more than just being about data access. It's actually about the ability for civil society to participate and to have a voice in understanding what kind of information is spreading online and in flagging up potential dangers. And that has everything to do from health misinformation to information that's spreading during natural disasters about evacuations, for instance, to election rumors. And civil society has to be part of that ecosystem to understand what's happening and to flag up potential dangers. And what Meta has done is essentially dramatically reduced that window by dramatically reducing the amount of people who can have a say and who can participate. And I also want to acknowledge the geographic impact of that decision is massive. So we're having this conversation in Washington, and most of the perspectives that we've heard today have been from people in the United States or focused on the United States. But there is organizing and actioning happening on this issue from all different parts of the world. And that not only highlights the fact that this issue matters to lots of different people working in lots of different contexts, but also the part that gives me hope is that we might be better organized to tackle it together. And so this panel really represents a subset of that work, primarily focused on the United States and Europe. And I want to open up this conversation to explore a little bit about the way forward that we have here in the United States. So to open it up to the panel now, I would like to ask each of you, so maybe we'll go Rebecca, Nadine, and then Alyssa, what is the current state of play regarding the ability of researchers and journalists to observe and report on the spread of information on social media platforms? So if you could just introduce yourself and your work in relation to that question.
Thanks, Brandy, and thanks to all the organizers for putting this somber event together today. I have been working on data access issues for more than 6 years now. Probably one of the strangest aspects of my career. I did not get into academia to speak to platforms and policymakers about how we need a better window into these social media companies and the ways that the flows of information across these platforms impact our daily lives, including the way that we speak to each other and share information about politics. But as soon as I began caring about these issues, caring about them from a researcher's perspective, I realized very quickly that we didn't have what we needed in order to do that fully, to get that full window of understanding into these dynamics. And that was 6 years ago. And things have unfortunately only gotten worse since then. We're now at a state of affairs that is frankly quite bleak. You know, for the last 2+ years, CrowdTangle was in pretty rapid decline. We knew that she wasn't doing well as the teams were taken off the upkeep. She wasn't getting any care anymore. But the fact that it is finally gone, I think, has really drawn a line for all of us who try to do work, whether we're researchers in academia or civil society or journalists, has really created this very clear, stark moment for us to understand just how bad the situation is. Of course, earlier than that, we took certainly a moment to mourn and to try and organize around no longer having access to the Twitter API. But somehow the CrowdTangle piece feels even more finite. What do we hope a little bit more for the future? What are we looking at right now that could leave us a bit more optimistic? Well, of course, we can turn to actions that are being taken in Europe, to the Digital Services Act, to the attempts that the European Commission is making to help researchers gain more access. And there are a few little nuggets, right, that we can talk about more later that do leave me with some optimism, but we are not there yet. And as we stride into 5 weeks from now, a really momentous election right here, right? It's all playing out very much here in DC. I'm worried, I'm concerned that we're simply not going to be able to, we haven't been able to, and we're not going to be able to keep on top of things like foreign malign interference, to understand the ways that motivated actors are trying to manipulate discourse around these issues. And it frightens me, right? I think it is appropriate to mourn this particular moment. 6 years on, I had hoped that I wouldn't be sitting here today, essentially eulogizing software, but that's where we are, and it's pretty remarkable.
Thanks, Rebecca. Nadine, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, thank you so much. It's really great to be here. And I think that Rebecca's starting with 6 years ago is quite apt from our perspective as well. Because in 2018, my organization, the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, proposed to Facebook that they amend its terms of service to establish a safe harbor for public interest research and journalism that would be focused on its platform. And then several months after that, 200 researchers, actually over 200 researchers, followed that proposal with an open letter supporting the request. But here we are, and it has yet to happen. And so what we had done is actually to propose a safe harbor for researchers that would be a legislative safe harbor. And we did that in part because our work focuses on free speech in the digital age. And we know that these platforms, as has been discussed, influence public discourse, right? They influence users, they influence the relationships with one another, and the ways in which information flows between them. And we need to know how, right? So what we have been hoping for, what we've been working toward, is this legislative safe harbor, a legal safe harbor that would permit researchers and journalists access to this information while still protecting the privacy of users and not interfering with the platform's operability, but really essentially taking that concern that is that the terms of service would create a situation in which researchers and journalists cannot access this information, and would not be able to use it, takes that concern away, essentially. And so when we think about this, look, we hear a lot from policymakers about the need to do something, right? We have to do something about the platforms, and we have seen myriad attempts, legislative attempts to do that. But the first thing we have to do is understand these platforms, because we need accountability, and accountability comes from knowledge and understanding. So if we have this legal safe harbor, our argument is that it helps the public understand, and it addresses understand and address the platform's practices when it comes to content moderation, when it comes to privacy, these other issues that are so important. So there have been a couple of areas of movement that I will share, and we can talk about these in terms of where they might go. But the first is the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, or PATA. It's a bipartisan bill, and it would create new mechanisms to increase transparency into social media platforms by requiring them to share certain data with the public and researchers, and by establishing a legal safe harbor for research in the public interest. Now, that has been introduced the past couple of Congresses. Again, as I mentioned, it is bipartisan, but it has yet to move as rapidly as we have hoped. In the House, we also have, actually just last week during an Energy and Commerce Committee markup of COSA and COPPA 2.0, Congresswoman Trahan introduced an amendment that would proffer a researcher safe harbor that would protect the collection of certain publicly available information for projects meant to inform the general public about matters of public concern, again, while protecting user privacy and protecting the operation of the platforms. Now, that amendment was introduced and then withdrawn because of the workings of the committee, but we're really happy to see this effort still gain steam and try to be continued. And so we're hoping that this will move forward as one mechanism to further this effort in the public interest and support researchers.
Lisa?
Can you hear me? Yes. First of all, thank you so much for gathering us here on this panel, Brandy, and really appreciate the comments from Rebecca and Nadine. My name is Alyssa Cooper. I'm the Executive Director of the Knight-Georgetown Institute, KGI, here at Georgetown. We're very happy to host you all on campus today and those of you joining remotely. KGI is a new center dedicated to connecting independent research with technology policy and design, focused on the online information environment. So these issues of access to data for a variety of different purposes, for research, for advocacy, for journalism, for public accountability, are at the core of everything that we are doing and planning as a new center here at Georgetown. And taking from our remembrances, our sort of collective mourning of CrowdTangle, I want to broaden out the aperture a little bit and think about what really is the state of play of data access today, and what are we going to do about making it better? So if we think about the options that exist today for somebody who wants to obtain access to data, there's really kind of two categories in my mind. One is platform-controlled access, and that might be through tools, through researcher APIs, or through direct research collaboration. CrowdTangle was one of those, obviously. And the other one is independent access, not mediated through the platforms. So if we think about platform-controlled tools, as a researcher at an accredited university, one might be able to put in a good amount of effort, let's say months, years of effort, in order to obtain vetted or approved status to be able to have access to these tools or to be able to engage in a research collaboration with a platform directly. Rebecca can tell us all about this, war stories. And a researcher who succeeds in gaining this access might then have a partial view into some data that the platform completely constrains as to what they can or cannot access. And all of those constraints really have nothing to do with what's in the public's interest. It has to do with what the platform wants to make available. If you're a journalist, or you work for an NGO, or if you're an advocate or a concerned citizen, these tools are likely not even available to you. Many platforms forbid access to such organizations from even being able to apply to use their researcher tools. So that's the platform-controlled bucket. Then if we think about the independent bucket, here we have commercial tools. So commercial tools, not really designed for research use cases. They're designed for brand protection. They're designed to be sold to other companies. And they may be cost prohibitive for a researcher or an individual to use. And then we have kind of DIY, do-it-yourself, build-it-yourself tools and scrapers that many researchers have developed. And these are really subject to the whims of the platforms as well. Every time the product changes or the APIs that are exposed change, then it's a scramble to try to keep up with what data feeds are even available through a platform anymore, and you have to adapt your tools. And there's duplication across research groups and individuals maintaining these tools because they're all independently developed. So when we take all of this together, what do we have? We have a patchwork of inconsistent, inadequate, platform-controlled, expensive, and by the way, legally murky tools, because there's a lot of legal risk out there for those who decide to go and build a scraper. There's been many lawsuits recently. And this is just woefully inadequate when we think about the public's right to know in a free and democratic society. It's not going to cut it. Here at KGI, we work with the public interest research community, and that includes journalists, it includes advocates, it includes academic researchers. And we know that this community is intimately familiar with the benefits and limitations of data access. We also know that they are uniquely positioned as a result to be able to articulate what the societal needs and benefits are of data access and to develop truly standardized and harmonized approaches to gather data, not just from Meta, not just from Facebook or Instagram, but across all platforms, to be able to develop a unified and harmonized view of what's actually happening in the online information environment. So, as sad as this event is, I'm going to pivot to something I'm very excited about, which is that we at KGI are launching a new initiative. It's called the Gold Standard for Publicly Available Platform Data. And the point of this initiative is to articulate in a cross-platform way what the data needs are for public accountability, to make a definition of what consists of public data, and to articulate what formats that data needs to be made available in, and what the infrastructural needs are to support true public cross-platform data access. The goal of the Gold Standard Initiative is to articulate this uniform cross-industry framework that will allow for an understanding of the online information environment, not mediated by platform-controlled silos. In recognition of the tremendous role that journalists and activists and civil society organizations have in crafting such a standard, we will be working together with those in research, in academia, in civil society, in journalism, to help develop this, to bring a real diversity of perspectives into the fold as we try to articulate what does cross-platform data access look like, and what should every platform be providing to any concerned citizen who wants to access public data. And the focus here really is specifically on public data, and it's meant to complement other efforts that focus on vetted researcher access and access to private data. So we're hopeful that by the end of this process, we'll be able to articulate what data should be made available in what formats and what the infrastructural considerations need to be in order to make this vision a reality. The other thing I'm hopeful about is that having this articulated in a truly clear way and a cross-industry way will help to support some of the policy initiatives that Rebecca and Nadine spoke about. So we'll help to plug into some of the enforcement activity around the Digital Services Act in Europe. Will serve as a reference point for federal and state legislators and enforcement authorities who are thinking about transparency and data access. Will be a reference for those in other jurisdictions who are considering transparency initiatives and mandates. And potentially, if I put my truly optimistic hat on, will help to drive a discussion within industry about how the existing tools can be made more harmonized, more open, and how they can drive better cross-platform comparison and investigation.
Thanks, Alyssa. I want to turn to you, Rebecca, so I live in Berlin, and when you talk about these issues around data access in Europe to virtually anybody, the first name that they say is Rebecca Tromble, because you've done so much work on both sides of the Atlantic on this issue. And I am thinking back as well to Ellen's remembrance that you gave, talking about the organizing that this event has essentially brought about and the way in which we are stronger now as a community to be able to tackle some of these things together. And so I'm curious, from your vantage point, Rebecca, what differences or similarities, I'm particularly interested in the differences, do you see between the US and Europe in this regard? And what lessons can we learn from over the past 6 years, at least, of the European context regarding how we make data access a priority for policymakers interested in tech regulation here in the US?
Yeah, the short answer is there are a lot of differences. let me back up for just 1 second and share how it is that I oddly, as an American who currently lives and works in Washington, D.C., became the European data access guru. I mentioned that I started all of this work 6 years ago. And at that time, I was an assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and was entering into this new exciting phase of my career where I was going to partner with Twitter as part of the Healthy Conversations initiative. And they were going to give the research team that I was leading access to all this incredible data that no one else got to see. And also, I had just been asked to be part of the European Advisory Committee for Social Science 1 with Facebook. Oh my gosh, my life was changing. 6 months later, I had nothing, none of the data that either of those companies had promised. And I got mad. And it turned out that I was an hour high-speed train ride away from Brussels. Policymakers in Brussels at the Commission were really starting to take this issue seriously. They were deeply concerned about particularly foreign disinformation that was impacting European politics. So we're starting up all sorts of new committees and discussions and so on. And they didn't know me from Adam. I just started showing up and talking in the rooms. But because I was this one odd duck who had the promises from both Twitter and Facebook simultaneously, people kept turning to me to ask, what's it like to work with these folks? And the answer every single time was, it's incredibly frustrating. They make all of these promises publicly. They get the press coverage. They whitewash and use our names to do it. And then they turn around and quietly give us nothing. And when we try to scream about it, they threaten to walk away, or, right, we just aren't even heard because who are we to the media? So luckily, some of the policymakers in Europe were paying attention, and now zoom forward 6 years, and we have data access promises under the European Union's Code of Practice on Disinformation, plus most crucially, Article 40 of the Digital Services Act. What made that possible? And again, I really underscore that we're not there yet, even with Article 40 of the Digital Services Act, because there are a bunch of additional steps that the Commission needs to take in order to make that functional. The parts that have gone into effect a year ago are still not functioning properly, because really everybody needs guidance from the European Commission on this. But the major difference is that the European Commission acted. Right? It is a very technocratic policy environment. And so if you work with the right folks within the executive realm, you can really move things forward in a way that it's much more difficult to do in the US when everything hinges on a completely dysfunctional Congress. So I just kept, even though I eventually moved back to the US, I've been here for the last 5 years, I continued to work very closely with the European research community and policymakers there, and I see the light at the end of the tunnel. But what I really want to underscore, where there's the key similarity, is that none of this is actually going to work, right? Whether we're talking about the compelled access that will be available to European researchers, potentially those outside of Europe as well. Again, we need the Commission to tell us what the rules are there. They haven't yet. Whether we're talking about the compelled access, or as Alyssa was just describing, better access to public data and developing standards there, we have to have the research community come together in order to make this functional. We need the research community to come together to set those standards, right? And here I want to be very clear. I'm not just speaking from my own vantage point here, the academic research community. I'm talking very much about those from civil society, as well as crucially journalists need to be at the table. We can't get to a gold standard, whether it's public access to data or access to private data, without the research community coming together to define that collectively. We also can't get there if researchers, particularly when we're talking about measures like the Digital Services Act, or if we can ever get PATA passed, fingers crossed, knock on wood, do all the things. researchers will have to apply for access. And if literally tens of thousands are applying for that sort of bespoke access from all across the world simultaneously, the entire system shuts down instantaneously. So what I've been arguing to European policymakers, and I think is the only thing that makes sense, even if we can get there eventually in the US context, is that there need to be priorities that are set, again, defined by the research community, but priorities that are set for common use data sets, for shared mechanisms like APIs and researcher sandboxes. But we need to create the spaces where those discussions can happen. And so I'm so thrilled that KGI is taking this on here in the US. That will operate in parallel to the work that I've been doing as a member of the Advisory Council for the European Digital Media Observatory to lead work to set up a new, what we're calling independent intermediary body or organization, a new nonprofit organization that will work to bring researchers together to help to define these priorities. But I can't underscore enough how important it is going forward, no matter the regime, that we have to do a ton of the work ourselves. We have to rely on ourselves and our community in order to move forward from here. We know we can't rely on the platforms. And even when we have the policymakers who have our back, that's not enough. We have to do the work too. So this is sort of my clarion call, right? No matter the context, the jurisdiction that we're in.
Thanks so much. And I think I want to turn to you back again, Alyssa, now, because actually your background is with standards bodies, no? And doing so much work on different kinds of standards. I'm curious how would you think about your previous experience and all of the past work you've done and coming into this work at KGI, what do you think that the research community, especially with regard to data access, can learn from that experience? Where you think are some of the areas where we might need to grow as well as a community to kind of reach the call that Rebecca has made?
Yeah, there's like this old joke for standards people, which is like, every time you see a problem, you see the opportunity to define a new standard. There's a great like XKCD about this as well. I should probably know the XKCD number off the top of my head, but I don't. But putting that aside, I do think that, you know, coming into this role, coming into KGI and learning so much from this community about the struggles that have come before with regard to data access, demonstrated a clear gap here when it comes to standardization and harmonization. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is that what you often see in technology standardization is in the pre-standardization phase, before the parties have decided that it's in their interest to come to the table, there's all this bilateral negotiating that's going on. So I worked in technology standards for the last 18 years, and the last 10 of those years I was at Cisco. Cisco might be thinking about some new, part of the technology stack, talking one-on-one to Apple, talking to Google, talking to Qualcomm, talking to Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, talking to Intel, all these separate conversations and potentially like separate feature development that's going on. And what that can lead to in the pre-standardization phase is a lot of incompatibility and a lot of special features here and there, systems that don't work well together, and frankly, a scaling problem. It's very inefficient to have all these separate conversations to try to achieve the same thing bilaterally between two companies' products. This is very similar to the situation that we're in today, to the situation that researchers like Rebecca and many others have faced, where it's like, okay, we want to think about what does the Twitter API give us? And maybe it doesn't give us quite what we want. And so we go and we talk to the team and we're like negotiating this, like, what can we actually get out of this API? Do we need different quotas? It's exactly the same situation that's gone on with the meta content library this year. Oh, does this feature quite match up to what we had with CrowdTangle? No, but it's better in this way. And Julia called this out very well in her eulogy. So you have all this friction around these bilateral negotiations. It's very opaque. And what you gain from standardization is that you move from those private bilateral negotiations into a communal conversation, into what do we as a collective need as the baseline that can further everybody's interests. and it's much more powerful and it's much more efficient when we get into a group conversation about where our common interests lie. So that's, I think, the first lesson. The second lesson is about incentives. So often the reason that technology companies come together to standardize something is because they realize that what they need is this harmonized baseline, and then they're going to differentiate themselves on top of the standard. So once we realize that if we come together collectively, we can save money, we can save time, and then we'll do our own thing as an add-on that we sell to our customers. That's kind of how it works in technology standardization. And sometimes the market provides those incentives for technology companies, and sometimes it doesn't. And in the case of researcher data access, the market is clearly failing, right? Because the companies are not incentivized to provide the kind of access that is needed to serve the public interest, to serve academia, to serve accountability, and to serve high quality journalism. That's, I think, been demonstrated. If you want to count 13 years or 6 years, the last 2 years, right? That's clear. So there needs to be some other incentive to bring people to the table. And sometimes in the tech industry, that's risk of litigation. Sometimes it's bad PR. Sometimes it's regulation, as we've seen in the European Union. You need some other driver to get people to come to the table. And that's partially why the DSA is exciting, because it creates that driver, creates a regulatory driver. But I think as we go into our initiative to define the gold standard for publicly available platform data, we're cognizant that writing down the standard is really the first step. We're not imagining that just by virtue of writing it down, people are going to adopt it. We're going to need some further incentive, in particular to bring the companies to the table and to bring a diversity of different actors into the conversation that Rebecca was talking about. So I think those two lessons about the efficiency of moving from the individual to the communal, and about the need for incentives as a backstop to cause the deployment and the adoption of the standard, and not just the articulation of the standard, are things that we need to keep in mind as we move forward.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. So I want to get back to this question about incentives shortly. But before that, I'm cognizant that a lot of the discussion so far has actually been about where the tech industry is with regard to data access, this kind of power analysis that we've been talking around. And earlier, I brought up the fact that the subset of this conversation that we're having, which is primarily focused on data access in the United States and to a certain extent lessons learned from Europe. I've spoken to people who have told me like most of the researchers across the African continent who are doing this type of research don't even have access to CrowdTangle, never had access to CrowdTangle, right? And so the variety of options look really, really different depending on who you are and what you're studying, where you sit in kind of professionalized civil society in terms of mechanisms available. And I'm curious, Nadine, the approaches that you all at the Knight First Amendment Institute are advocating for are really aimed at this, types of people who are doing industry independent work entirely and trying to avoid any kind of, or maybe at least in some of their methods, at least trying to avoid any kind of interaction or reliance on technology companies to facilitate access to data. And so I was hoping you could tell us a bit about why that matters. So given the legal context in the United States, what are the threats and challenges that researchers face who take this industry independent approach? And how is the safe harbor provision aimed at intervening in that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, you're absolutely right that one of the most critical aspects of this is the fact that it enables industry independent researchers, right? And that is the necessary antidote, I would say, to the self-policing aspect of these platforms. They just trust us, we have it, you can rely on our own data to show you what's happening. And I really love actually earlier when Dave was speaking, he talked about CrowdTangle and how it allowed for big listening. I think that's a critical point as well, is like having that pardon the pun, the platform really to understand what's happening more. I think when we think about this, looking at the control that platforms have had, there's a great quote from a recent Ninth Circuit case that talks about what it means to allow platforms to have this modicum of control. And I'm going to quote here. And it says that giving social media platforms free rein to decide on any basis who can collect and use data that the companies do not own, that they otherwise make publicly available to viewers, and that the companies themselves collect and use, risks the possible creation of information monopolies that would disserve the public interest. That's really what we're talking about here, is that what we're looking for with these safe harbors is the opportunity to protect researchers and allow them to conduct that critical research that helps inform the public about issues that are so crucial to our everyday existence. We need research on topics like in misinformation, on digital well-being, insights into online behavior, into and how those might correspond with offline effects, how they might engage in the analog world, if you will, risk to children online. All of these things have been found to be absolutely critical to our collective online health, and yet we don't have that independent understanding of what actually is happening. And you mentioned, rightfully so, that there are significant legal risks to this. I think the incentive discussion is a really important one because sometimes it is about litigation, right? And that might be a threat, but we also know that threat for litigation on the part of these particularly independent researchers or journalists is exponentially more because of the immense cost that it has in terms of actual funds and as well as time and reputation and career, et cetera. So when you don't have a safe harbor, researchers and journalists risk running afoul of the platform's terms of service. And these terms of service can prohibit all kinds of things, right? They can prohibit just really basic automated collection of public information. They can prohibit the creation and the use of temporary research accounts that are designed to collect information, again, in the public interest. And the potential for violation of the terms of service creates an incredible risk for these individuals and their organizations because of the legal liability associated with such a potential violation. So you're looking at breach of contract, right, where someone is deemed to have breached the terms of service. You are looking at potential civil and criminal liability under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act because that has been interpreted to prohibit violation of a website's terms of service. So when you have these kind of stacked risks against researchers, against journalists who are trying to do this work in the public interest, it creates that disincentive for them, which ultimately is harmful to the public. And I would come back to the fact that it also, having this information does not only support and protect the public and have an understanding as to what we're actually doing when we are engaging online, what's happening to our information and what is being essentially done to users, but it also informs policymakers because, as I mentioned earlier, we know that there is quite a bit of support from policymakers with wanting to understand more about what's happening on the platform, wanting to address some of the significant harms that have occurred, but maybe not having the full and fulsome reporting that would be necessary to support that type of legislation. So having this information from researchers would ultimately support policymakers as well.
Thanks, Nadine. And so to come back then to the question of incentives, which I think is really important, I'm reminded of a similar anecdote to one you shared, Rebecca, of when I was at the Mozilla Foundation previously, I did a lot of research into YouTube and in particular to YouTube's recommendation algorithm. And I remember sitting in a room with the team. I was also involved in advocacy around transparency, more algorithmic transparency from YouTube. And them essentially sitting across from me saying, you know, we're not going to do anything until the DSA comes into force, right? Because there was no incentive to do that. They knew that a new regulation was coming down the pipeline and that they would be told by policymakers how it should be implemented. And so the idea that they would do anything before that mark was unrealistic. So I'm curious, thinking about, say, the next 6 months timeline, maybe 1 year, what do you think are, to each of you, are the opportunities that we have and the greatest levers that we should look at when we think about shifting incentives to try to make some of this happen?
That's easy for me. The best lever and incentive we have is a fine of 6% of all global revenue, which can be levied by the European Commission against any one of the very large online platforms or search engines, which all of the platforms that we've been talking about here today qualify as under the DSA. I think, unfortunately, we are past the world where a bunch of really negative press is going to get any of these platforms to move. That did actually exist at one point in time. It's part of the reason why I think CrowdTangle was so successful for as long as it was. It was really given life, and a lot of these initiatives were really given life at a moment when the platforms were under immense scrutiny from policymakers globally, but particularly in the US, as well as Europe, but particularly, most importantly, frankly, in the US, and from journalists, right? The policymakers were putting the pressure because journalists had done such a great job reporting on these things. But those transparency initiatives just got them more flack. It didn't actually solve any of the problems that they thought they were trying to solve. And so they've backed away from all of that. And I think we're now in a world where, in fact, everyone will just be saying the sorts of things that you heard, Brandy, which is, unless somebody compels us to do it, you can forget about it. That said, there will be, I think, still a handful of small initiatives, new partnerships that are announced. I ask my colleagues, as someone who has learned the hard way, who has gone and tried every good faith route of partnering with these various platforms, just don't be tempted by it anymore. Like, it will take so much of your time and energy for very little payoff, very little payoff. And in fact, probably, like, these initiatives, unfortunately, have the potential to actually end careers, particularly for junior scholars. So yeah, how do we create the incentives? We get more policymakers to take these issues seriously. I think that's the bottom line. Now, are there other things that we can do in the meantime in order to set the landscape for that, to set the table, the environment, create an environment where it's much easier for policymakers to step in and be like, well, they've laid all the groundwork, now you just go do the thing, and we're writing this into code or law or whatever it might be. Absolutely. Those are the things we need to be thinking about. And that's precisely where things like developing standards can really help the conversation move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start sort of in the same place, but think a little bit more broadly about the potential power of the DSA. And, you know, assuming strong enforcement of the DSA, it will show that there's no excuse for not providing access to data. Like, what would the excuse be that we can only do this in Europe? There really isn't one, in particular when we think about public data. So I am hopeful that as DSA enforcement continues to mature and we get more clarity and the commission resolves its open investigations and takes on new enforcement actions, that what we start to see is a demonstration of what is possible, to the point where we find ourselves in a situation that no company can argue that something that they're clearly providing in one jurisdiction cannot be provided in other jurisdictions. And so that's why I think the effect of the DSA could potentially be broader than just confined to the European Union. So I think that's one aspect to watch for. I think in general, the fact that there's bipartisan interest in tech accountability, and there remains so in the US, is definitely something to be leveraged. No question, the policy environment in the United States is very challenging. But we do see policymakers from both sides of the aisle who come to this issue through their own motivations and are interested in coming to the table. If we don't restrict ourselves only to the federal legislative landscape, there's potentially other opportunities. There's a lot of kind of strategic litigation that is going on, and one could imagine transparency requirements folding in somehow there. So I think the fact that there continues to be broad interest across the political spectrum in tech accountability is another factor to think about over the coming year. And that also helps us, think past the election, that not everything is subject to whatever the outcome of the election is, because we anticipate there will be policymakers on both sides of the aisle who come back or start a new term and are interested in this topic. And then lastly, what I'll say is, I'm so sad that I'm going to be the first person to say AI today at this event, but there we go, I said it. Obviously, there's tremendous interest in generative AI, in particular in the policymaking sphere. And specifically, a lot of that conversation is about the black box nature of these large language models. What data goes into them? How are they trained? Why can't we explain what they do? Many, many aspects that dominate the current tech policy conversation as it has been taken over by generative AI relate to transparency and accountability. And it's like a small leap from that conversation to the one that we've been having here today. So if we think that there's a prospect on the horizon that some set of technology companies are going to be required to allow third parties to red team their models or required to disclose more detail about the data that they use to train these models, I don't know, last time I looked at social media, it's like a giant pile of machine learning models. So if we think that there's a prospect of those kinds of requirements coming into play for whatever people want to call AI, then I think we should take a hard look at how that can be leveraged in order to achieve many of the goals that we've been talking about here today. And that's another thread that will clearly have a lot of active conversation in the year to come. And I think we need to think about how we bring those two things together.
I would second all of that. I mean, I think that policymakers right now in the U.S. in particular are the next step. They are the answer. And again, I've mentioned that we had this amendment introduced in the House earlier. I've been really pleased to see the movement there. Obviously grateful to policymakers in the Senate who have made PATA possible, and to see that momentum that it has grown, there is bipartisan interest. And of course, the AI question, generative AI question in particular, is a looming one, and one that I think many lawmakers want to get ahead of. And this is obviously one route to do so. But I also think that making this happen means that we have to work together. So I would say to anyone who's watching this, if you are a transparency person, if you are a privacy person, if you are interested in public discourse, shaping of the digital public square, concerns about speech online, all of these interests and several others in terms of protecting research and researchers and journalists as well, these are all opportunities for us to work together. I think a coordinated effort is always the best effort. Working in coalition is how we get things done. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for us to continue to work together and to make this something that we just don't let go, because we need to see it happen. We need to see it come to fruition. It is in our public interest. And I think that it's only going to become more so as these technologies emerge. So I would say that the more that we can work together, the better off we will be.
Thank you so much to all of you. And I think that each of your responses to that question have really highlighted the need for a concerted and organized effort around data access that focuses on things like standards, and also focuses on things like how do we shift incentives and how do we leverage the momentum that has been generated through the Digital Services Act and the real potential to put real pressure on companies to act on data access and transparency towards this effort here in the United States. And so I think that provides me at least with a lot of hope about what we can do with a more organized community with a concerted effort around transparency, and to the point that you just made, Nadine, to sort of link that to all of these other issues in a way that is thoughtful and that leverages strategic communications as a tool. Because I think one of the things that this debate has struggled with has been the notion that data access for researchers is, I see Jamie in the audience has said, I think it's like everyone's fourth favorite issue or fifth favorite issue. I think linking that to other issues that folks care about and really showing why transparency and researcher access is so critical to making progress on so many of the issues that we care about regarding healthier online ecosystems is super important. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much to this panel of amazing people, not only for agreeing to go along with the whole funeral thing, but also because of your work. Truly, I really, really am so grateful to all of you and to be here in community together. With that, I will hand it back over to Dave.
That was a great panel. So I want to close by summarizing. I was thinking while I was sitting in the audience about the ways that 2011, when CrowdTangle was born, differ from today. And I want to suggest to you that 2011 was a more innocent time. Facebook had not gone public yet. It was still kind of the Web 2.0 era. And CrowdTangle, born in that moment, signals to us, or at least signals to me, that we can have nice things. But we can only have nice things up until it becomes trouble for the platforms. That stays true until we make demands. And once those demands are enshrined in law, as we're seeing across the Atlantic, then those platforms are no longer giving us nice things out of largesse, but out of a duty to society. I think we as a community are also less innocent than we were in 2011. The ambitions of 2011, and that was still back when we kind of believed that we would crowdsource everything. Tim O'Reilly, just a few years before that, had written Government as a Platform, and that still seemed like an idea that was going to happen, at least to younger me. So I think in the years that have followed, we've also lost some of our innocence and come to recognize that power yields nothing without a demand. So I believe that the best way that we can do justice to CrowdTangle, and it is a little weird holding a funeral for a piece of software, but the best way that we can recognize this was a nice thing that was lost because it became trouble for the platforms is to say we together are going to find these ways to make demands. From the panel today, we have heard what I think are some fantastic ideas for how to move ourselves there. It will not be quick or easy because these are trillion-dollar companies that we're asking to cause trouble for. But these are trillion-dollar companies that now dominate our information environment. So we as citizens have to demand this transparency. They are simply too big to be left to offer nice things to us only when it is convenient for them. So thank you all for coming here, and let's make this a moment that leads us forward to make collective demands together. Thank you all.